Hello, everyone. I'm Alice Resende. I'm the assistant curator at UTS Gallery in our collection. Thank you all for coming. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. I would further like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various ancestral lands from which our attendees join us today, and to pay respects to those elders past and present. I warmly welcome all First Nations people who have joined us in person and on Zoom today. UTS Gallery would like to thank our exhibition partners, UTS Business School and UTS Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, Jessie Street National Women's Library, UTS Library, UTS Media Lab and Creative Australia. Your support for Zenny Beg's exhibition, Elsie and Minnie, has enabled us to be gathered here today for this important discussion. Elsie and Minnie is a UTS Gallery commission exhibition of new screen works by the artist Zenny Beg that reflect on the origins of the women's refuge movement in Australia and the ongoing crisis of gendered violence today. The exhibition is on show at the gallery until September 5, with an archival satellite display also showing at UTS Library. This talk today forms part of a suite of public programs around the exhibition. I'd like to extend a final thank you to Zenny Beg for offering the provocation for today's program, and to our extraordinary panelists for generously giving their time. Ashlee Donohue, CEO, Mudjingal Aboriginal Corporation, Jess Hill, Industry Professor, and Dr. Anne Summers, Professor of Domestic and Family Violence, UTS Business School. I will now hand over to our moderator, Annabelle Daniels, CEO, Women's Community Shelters.
And a huge thank you to Alice and the UTS team for their preparations for today. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the huge and ongoing work of Aboriginal women in their contribution to violence prevention, and also to note that Aboriginal women are more likely to experience domestic and family violence and serious impacts, more likely to die in domestic homicides, more likely to be hospitalised. And we also know that they're more likely to be at risk of homelessness as a result of the combined impacts of violence and colonisation. So that's an important framing of the discussion that we're having today. And I would also like to introduce our panellists a little bit further. So we have Ashlee Donohue, a courageous Dunghutti woman, author, educator and CEO of Mudjingal Aboriginal Women's Corporation in Redfern. Woo! We also have just a few more notes on Ashlee, because she is extraordinary. Born and raised in Kempsey, New South Wales, her journey from surviving a 14-year abusive relationship to becoming a leading voice against domestic and family violence is nothing short of inspiring. Her memoir, Because I Love Him, Ashlee uses her pain to spark change and foster hope for others. She's also co-created Hey Sis, We've Got Your Back, the only Aboriginal women's sexual assault network in Australia, and has developed education programs for the NRL and Country Rugby League domestic violence programs. She holds a Masters of Education from UTS, earned the UTS Human Rights Reconciliation Award, and was selected as a Roberta Sykes Scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School. She sits on the City of Sydney's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Panel and DV New South Wales's Aboriginal Advisory Committee. She's a frequent media commentator, appearing on ABC's The Drum, NITV, SBS, and speaking at the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Please join with me in welcoming Ashlee again. Okay. Jess Hill. Jess is a journalist, author and speaker who focuses primarily on social issues and gendered violence. She started her career as a producer for ABC Radio, went on to become a Middle East correspondent for the Global Mail, and then an investigative journalist for Background Briefing. Her reporting has won 2 Walkley Awards, not one, but 2, an Amnesty International Award and 3 Our Watch Awards. Her first book, See What You Made Me Do, on the phenomenon of domestic abuse and coercive control, was released in 2019 and was awarded the 2020 Stella Prize. In 2021, it was adapted into a series on SBS. Her projects include a podcast series on coercive control and patriarchy called The Trap, a quarterly essay on how Me Too has changed Australia titled The Reckoning, and another quarterly essay in 2025 entitled Losing It, which has sparked debate about the prevention of violence in Australia. She's spoken at hundreds of public events about coercive control and regularly conducts training and education for groups as diverse as magistrates, high school students, workplaces and local councils. She is also an industry professor at the UTS Business School. Please welcome my colleague Jess. And last but by no means least, Dr. Anne Summers AO is a journalist, commentator and best-selling author of 9 books, including the classic Damned Whores and God's Police, first published in 1975 and still in print. Her most recent book, Unfettered and Alive, a memoir, was published in 2018. Anne was recently appointed Professor of Domestic and Family Violence in the School of Business at UTS Sydney. She has been awarded funding by the Paul Ramsay Foundation and UTS to continue her innovative data-based research into domestic violence in Australia. Her recent report, The Choice, Violence or Poverty 2022, used previously unpublished ABS data to reveal the far greater prevalence of domestic violence than was previously known, and especially the shockingly high incidence among women who have become single mothers as a result. The report argued that the federal government is responsible for policy-induced poverty. That is the fate of more than 50% of single mothers who are forced to rely on government benefits as their sole income. Previously, Anne has advised Prime Ministers Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, run the Office for the Status of Women, been Canberra Bureau Chief for the Australian Financial Review newspaper, Editor-in-Chief of Australia's leading feminist magazine, Ms., Editor of Good Weekend, Chair of the Board of Greenpeace International and a Trustee of the Powerhouse. She has been an activist in the women's movement since its inception in 1974 and was involved in establishing Elsie Women's Refuge, the first modern shelter for women and children escaping domestic violence. She was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for her services to journalism and to women in 1989, had her image on a postage stamp as an Australian legend in 2011, and in 2017 was inducted into the Australia Media Hall of Fame. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Anne Summers. And for those who might not know me, I'm just a fangirl that gets to moderate. So we have set ourselves an ambitious topic to talk about today. So the title of this panel is A Future Without Patriarchal Violence. Full stop. It's not phrased as a question, interestingly. So I'm going to assume that we must all have some hope that it is in some way achievable. The other thing that I will note is that we've named a word that we're not using all that often in public discourse at the moment, patriarchal. Books like Angela Saini's The Patriarchs highlight that patriarchy isn't the inevitable social structure. And Australia, prior to colonisation, was more gender equal. So today we're asking not only how do we respond to patriarchal violence, but whether we can ask and imagine a future that rejects patriarchal systems entirely. What would it mean to truly build safety, sovereignty, and self-determination into the core of how we address violence? And on that note, I'll come to you, Ashlee. Could you talk about how Aboriginal women's power and what we can learn from history, especially about Aboriginal-led community safety spaces?
Yes, we can. Hello everyone, I am Ashlee Donohue. That was a wonderful introduction to me and everybody else. And I am a proud Dunghutti woman, born and raised in Kempsey, and because of that, I too will acknowledge the land we meet on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, pay my respect to elders past and present, and also reiterate that sovereignty was never ceded. This is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. When we talk about Aboriginal women and power, I've took notes, because these questions are questions I don't just come off the top of my head. And as I'm doing right now, if I don't stay focused, I will go off on my own little tangent. So I'm going to read from notes. So as I said, when we talk about Aboriginal women's power, we are talking about something that existed long before colonisation, a power grounded in connection to country, community and culture. Before invasion, many of our nations had governance systems that were not built on patriarchy. Women held decision-making authority, managed resources, carried law, L-O-R-E, and were protectors of family and land. Men and women had different but equally valued roles, and those roles were underpinned by respect and reciprocity. I can never say that word right. Colonisation disrupted that balance and imposed patriarchal systems that have harmed our communities ever since. But that original balance is not gone. We see it in the way Aboriginal women continue to lead today, creating safety and healing spaces when no one else will. Aboriginal-led community safe spaces, whether women's centres like Mudgingol, the one where I'm CEO, healing circles or culturally safe crisis responses, are built on the principle that our women know what works for our women. They centre relationships, trust and cultural authority. That's the saying that is thrown around now, we are all the experts on our own life. That seems to only be for all other women except Aboriginal women, because in this space, all decisions are made for us. We are left out of tables, we are left out of all the things, or there's only one person speaking. Who can name an Aboriginal person that sits at the top of something in this space? And yet everything around, see, I'm going off tangent, power and history disempowers our women. And so we have to have these honest conversations. If we're going to say that we're truth tellers, then we have to tell the whole truth. The power was taken from Aboriginal people during colonisation, and people say, oh, get over it, get over this. But I'll tell you a little story about myself. My mother was 15 years old and sent to Sydney to clean houses. She got pregnant with me at 16. She was booked into Crown Street Hospital. She was told to get back home because they were still taking babies off their children then. When I was born in Kempsey District Hospital on the 31st of December 1968, after giving birth to me, my mother was put in what they called the veranda ward, which was exactly that, a veranda with green mesh around it. But I was put in the nursery. So the disengagement right there, the power from my mother was taken as for being a mother in that very instance. So when we talk about power and disempowering Aboriginal women, we've got to start there. It's not just in the violence space, it's in all the spaces. And we have to be clear on that.
Thanks, Ashlee. And Jess, we know that there are other examples of cultures where gender justice has been a more prevalent underpinning. Can you talk to us about some of those you've come across in your research?
Yeah, sure. And like Ashlee, I just want to acknowledge the elders here who have, for millennia, really set that example. And I think when you look at the way that we respond to domestic, family and sexual violence here in Australia compared to, say, the UK, I think that influence from Aboriginal women particularly is so strong that we actually, we tend, even though systems also continue to tend more towards punishment, the whole narrative around restoration and healing is so much more prevalent here, and I think that is almost entirely due to the influence of Aboriginal women, particularly around men, which has always been a vexed issue for feminists, and it's always been a bit of a crowbar of separation between Aboriginal women and non-Aboriginal women in this space. Before I go to that question, I just wanted to maybe set a bit of a framing statement, and that is that, patriarchy didn't create violence. There was sexual violence. There's been sexual violence in societies for many millennia, including societies that have more egalitarian and care-based cultures. So I think when we talk about a world without patriarchal violence, we're not saying a world in which violence does not occur at all. We're talking about a very particular form of violence coming to an end, and that is a harm that comes from and reinforces the systems that privilege men, whiteness, heteronormativity, adults over children. And I think really when you talk to victim survivors, you're talking to people who've experienced either an incident or an entire lifetime or a course of conduct that's been harmful. Often what they will say is the secondary harm that was done to them by their communities or by their families or by the institutions that betrayed them can be worse. So that secondary harm, that is something that is absolutely in our power to end. We can't stop every person from using violence. We can stop them from using violence with impunity, and we can decide who gets believed, who gets supported. That's what an end to for me, that's how I sort of conceive of an end to patriarchal violence. I'm sure the two panellists and Annabelle will have things to add to that. So, but to Annabelle's question, instead of just reframing it, because like a journalist, I'm just like, yes, nice question, but I'll answer the question I'd like to answer. Even though I actually asked her to ask me that question. Unbelievable.
See what I have to deal with.
Yeah, luckily we're good friends. Anyway, but yes, like we know such societies have existed. We know, as Ashlee just outlined, that such societies existed here in Australia, and this is where we actually can draw a lot of inspiration for where we could return to, or in that Hegelian way, sort of reimagine, bring these two worlds together. But I think what was really interesting to me early in my research was that early suffragists in the US, they were able to actually imagine what a world without the rigidity of patriarchy, what that world could look like, because they looked to the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, the local Native American population on the east coast of America. And there was that egalitarian culture. The clan mothers would appoint and remove chiefs, they held veto power, they governed by consensus. And the authority of women was embedded in the law, in land ownership, in community welfare. That was evident before the colonisation of the United States. And you had these early suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Gage, who looked at that and said, well, we don't have the right to vote, we don't have property rights, we are absolutely under the yoke of male power, but we look across to the women in this other society who have obviously been colonised into this state of patriarchy now, but in these pre-contact documents that had been made by this society, they could see what had pre-existed. And I think, just to quote Elizabeth Stanton, she said, "The position of women among the Iroquois is a proof that the rights of woman have been violated not because of her nature, but because of the circumstances of civilization. Among the Iroquois, women owned the lands, chose the chiefs, and had the power to depose them. Their position was the foundation of the government." So those examples, they really grounded those early feminist critiques. And I think that's why we don't need to be unrealistic about what we imagine, but we need to be able to see, you need to be able to see what you want a dream to be, in a way, to be completely pat. And I think those pre-colonised societies show us that this is possible. What we don't know is how to undo patriarchy once it's already embedded.
Really powerful reflections there. How could we walk it back if we were to want to? I'm going to take us a little bit of a fast forward now to a very singular and important event that is actually the subject of the exhibition of which this panel is a part, and talk about how in 1974 a group of women squatted in a vacant property in Glebe to create the first women's refuge in Australia, Elsie. This wasn't just a crisis response, it was a radical act. Women created a space outside of patriarchal structures based on principles like self-help, collective management and political activism. Aboriginal women were also integral to ELSI and were also leading parallel initiatives in their own communities at the same and similar times. And I'd like us to talk a little bit about what's happened in the past and what stayed the same. And so to you, Anne, can you reflect on the origins of this movement and the feminist principles that it was built on, and perhaps then moving on to how this still shows up in the work today or doesn't, in your view? No, sorry about that.
I'll certainly try. Oh, sorry, thanks. I'll certainly try to answer that. But just before I do, I'd just like to make a brief comment on Jess's comments about patriarchy. And in thinking about this, I mean, the questions that Annabelle has prepared are all very challenging, I think, and have forced, I think we've all agreed that it forced us to, when we got them, we thought, oh yeah, I'll look at them later. And it was...
That's quite hard.
Yeah, I couldn't just look at them later. I had to actually do some work and think about it. Which is...
Oops, sorry about that, folks.
No, this is good. I mean, we need to be pushing ourselves, because we do tend to be saying the same things over and over, and that's not getting us very far. But, you know, in trying to think about what patriarchy means, you know, and there are many ways to define it, many ways to look at it, but I decided the way that I want to look at it, and that kind of reflects the sort of research that I've been doing over the past few years, and that is economic research, is that patriarchy really is all about money, and people who have money and all people who don't have money are victims of patriarchy. People who have money are its, if you like, its custodians and its implementers. And when you think back, I was struck by your mention of the suffragettes, Jess, because when you think back to the way in which the vote was given, not so much in Australia, but in other countries, that the vote first of all went to men of property, and then working class men of property, and then women of property. But it took a long time before the vote went to people who had nothing. Mm. And so patriarchy and politics, or patriarchal form of politics, was very integrally intertwined with the notion of power emanating from money. And when we come a bit later on to talk about some of the research I've been doing lately, it is all about money, and the use of money and the abuse of money, and how women who don't have money are the most vulnerable people in this society. But to get back to ELSI, it's sort of interesting, I think, about some of the myths that have grown up about ELSI, and it's kind of now seen as a feminist paradise from day one, and the sort of golden gates of ELSI you walk through, and everything was solved. This wasn't quite true.
Having set up a refuge or two, I believe you, Anne.
But the whole question about whether or not you asked whether or not it was set up on feminist principles. Sort of the irony in that is that at the time, this is in 1974, at the time, those of us who did set up ELSI, we decided that we needed to do something very practical, i.e. provide shelter and 24-hour shelter and a home and other forms of assistance for women escaping violence. We wanted to get away from feminist theory, because feminist theory was what we thought, women are sitting around in circles at Women's House in Alberta Street with their mirrors looking at their clits and all the rest of it. And that was all very interesting and exciting and quite a revelation for most of us. But, and we talked about consciousness, and we talked about, theory and patriarchy, but we didn't do anything practical except for ourselves, And when we started ELSI, there was huge criticism by the so-called feminist consciousness theorists that we shouldn't be doing it. It wasn't the job of feminists, not that we called ourselves feminists back then, we were still women's liberationists, but it wasn't our job to be social workers or to provide services for women. And so we sort of fell into a way of doing things, partly by necessity, because suddenly, you know, as we've said before in many recent forums about Elsie, suddenly here's this group of young women, mostly, you know, under 30, most of us students, most of us knowing nothing, with this huge responsibility, women and kids who were very traumatised, very distressed, needed help. We had no money, we had no way of helping them. So we had to learn very quickly. And we very soon learnt that the principles on which the women's movement was being run at the time didn't work. I mean, some of you here will remember a very famous document around that time which came out of America, which was called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Because we blithely thought that we didn't need organisation, everything was going to be done by collective and collective decision making, and no one needed to take any responsibility for anything. Well, that's fine when you're sitting around Alberta Street, but it wasn't fine when you're at 73 Derwent Street and you've got 30 women and 30 kids, all needing to be fed, all needing help. And so the feminist principles of running a refuge evolved out of necessity. And in turn, I wasn't there for the critical parts of it, but the thing that was really striking about it, and I think the thing that perhaps Annabelle you're referring to in saying how do we recapture some of that today, was that who were the bosses, who were the clients, who was who, and who was paying the rent? Well, actually nobody. And until eventually Labor got in and they let us live there for rent-free for a while. But what we soon learnt, that there was no real power structure that the women who started the refuge and who were desperately trying to keep it going, and the women who were seeking refuge there, that were actually pretty much the same, even if we might be different in terms of our class, in terms of our needs, in terms of all sorts of ways. We were there for a common purpose. And it wasn't long before the women who initially were called clients said they wanted to have a say in the way things were run. They didn't like it. They didn't like all that bloody brown rice and crap like that. And they didn't like the way decisions were being made about them by these women sitting in the front room who really had no qualifications at all. And so the feminist theory of how to run a refuge really developed kind of perforce. And they turned out to be, they've turned out to be quite traumatic at times, and they didn't always work well, and there was a lot of fighting and a lot of tears and a lot of disagreement. But out of all of that, there did come a model that did work. And that was, the hierarchy wasn't the way to do it. We had to find ways of sharing the power and sharing the responsibility. And that's pretty much what happened. And that is the thing I think that a lot of people, and we had the Elsie conference last year, a lot of people mourn the fact that has been lost, and that we've now become perhaps a little too hierarchical, maybe we're a little too... structurelessness is terrible because it hides autocracy and bullying. But we do need to have some structures, and we need to be very conscious about how we set them up and who they work for.
Oh, it's powerful reflections. And I might then jump around a little bit actually and come to you on that then, Jess. So you've spoken a little bit about the depoliticisation of the domestic violence movement, where crisis management perhaps and where government stepping in has replaced some of that feminist activism. How do you think that shift in approach or the governmentalisation might have affected outcomes for women and children?
Yeah, well, I think this is how we met, is when I first started covering this issue was in 2014. And for those of you who have worked in the refuge movement for years, or perhaps even were working back then, 2014 was a real turning point for the refuge movement in New South Wales. It's like it suddenly went back to the future, where these feminist-run refuges were handed back to the big faith agencies by way of what I think was quite systematic by the minister at the time, Prue Goward, to defeminise the movement. There was what I would characterise as quite a dishonest tender process that went on that was extremely traumatising for the women-run refuges, such that when I was calling people to speak to them and interview them for this monthly piece that I wrote, which was the first ever piece I wrote on this subject, people were talking to me like I was asking them about organised crime. Like they were like, you cannot mention my name to anyone, but here's what I know. And it's just like, why is everybody feeling so under threat? And it soon became evident because not only were they facing losing control of their refuges, but these people are looking after women and kids who are under threat of homicide. This is not just, well, how am I going to continue in this job, or how am I going to, continue my career? This is how are we going to keep these people safe, and is it safe to hand it back to the big faith agencies? This is how, when Anne started Elsie's, when she co-founded it, the whole point was to stop it being in the hands of the faith agencies, because so often what they wanted was actually counter to what the women and kids needed. Things like reproductive rights and all those sorts of things. And I think also around that hierarchy and, centering dignity rather than just taking pity. The feminist movement as it grew, as Anne says, not from pre-existing feminist principles, but as those principles emerged, that thing of like, we are in this together. We don't infantilise you. We help support each other. We learn from each other. So I think so in New South Wales, I think it's more stark than perhaps around the country, but everywhere the refuge movement has been professionalised. And look, like there's a certain extent to which there's a necessity to that just because of the scale. And so the gains that have come from much more government intervention in this area, which were felt by Elsie after one of your workers told the minister or whoever it was that knocked on the door to piss off initially. But, it brought in sustainability, right? So funding, services, but also if you've got government involved, it's a recognition that this is a public issue that requires a public response, that it's not just a niche feminist issue or a niche issue for women to run privately. So that it's almost like a necessary trade-off. But because that's happened, the political edge and the way that these refuges doubled as political operatives, that has to a large extent been lost. Not entirely, Exhibit A, but largely. And, we saw that in some, particularly when the coalition was in government, where actual funding, it was predicated that you do not do advocacy. And otherwise your funding is under threat. So, but how else do we get the changes that actually prevents these refuges from being necessary in the first place? Who does that? Who does that? Historically, it's been frontline workers. So I think what we're talking about today, dismantling patriarchal power, addressing economic inequality, there's been a fair neutering of what was probably the most powerful part of that movement. And so now I feel like that movement is quite fractured. It's often conducted under the aegis of government. So even when you talk about, we talked about primary prevention just briefly before coming on, and people talk about gender inequality, but they don't talk about patriarchy. They talk about what is sort of socially acceptable to talk about, what's palatable to government, but the more radical nature of it, the radical imaginings, I think have been lost. Maybe not forever, but certainly they are in a cryogenic chamber. And maybe they can be reanimated. It's a really vexed issue. How do we re-agitate and have even just a part of that radical history reanimated whilst still operating at scale?
And I think those are really interesting points. If we make a bit of a jump, sort of from the 2014 era to now, I would offer a slightly more hopeful counterpoint, probably in the sense that so many victim survivors, the advocacy of victim survivors has been a huge feature of the last, sort of 10 or so years. We've seen that shift and the awareness of domestic and family violence grow so significantly to be a public issue. And on that note, we're talking so much more about coercive control over the last 5 years, really, in a lot of ways, kicked off by the murder of Hannah Clark and her children, and the conversation that sort of grew from that. And I do want to get to that and come to both you and Jess, but I want to come to Ashlee first, because we now do have this understanding that domestic and family violence, we know it's more than physical violence, but it's really important that that we continue to make space and recognise and not turn away from the very real physical violence that Aboriginal women experience. And how do we continue to highlight that and not minimise that or make it just more palatable for an everyday audience?
And that's been my issue with the coercive control. Like, I respect the work that's been done. I don't particularly agree with everything that's been said and done either. The issue for me, and I've written this down so I don't go off topic, the focus on coercive control has been important. It's helped name patterns of abuse that were often invisible, and it's opened up new conversations about how power and control operate. But for Aboriginal women, we can't allow that focus to erase or minimise the very real, very extreme physical violence we are experiencing. Our women are among the most victimised in the country. We are 34 times more likely to be hospitalised due to family violence. That's not a theory. That's a daily reality for Aboriginal women, and we make up less than 2% of the population. If we only talk about violence as controlling behaviours without naming the broken bones, the murders, the children growing up in homes where the violence is visible and constant, we are not telling the whole truth. We also have to remember the intersection here. Aboriginal women are dealing with violence in intimate relationships while also experiencing systemic violence from police, courts and prisons. We can't separate them. So making space means this. We have to hold both truths at once. Yes, recognise coercive control, but do not let it become the new polite way of talking about violence in a way that sanitises what's happening to our women. The work must still centre physical safety, urgent responses and the cultural community-led solutions that actually keep our women alive. That's my take on the coercive control space.
Thanks, Ashlee.
Can I weigh in just very briefly?
Go for it.
I think I agree with Ashlee in the sense that it's been difficult because coercive control has, I think, been probably misinterpreted to be only the non-physical coercive behaviours. And I think where the national principles on coercive control got it right was to say this is actually just the umbrella under which even sadistic acts of physical and sexual violence can occur, that the controlling behaviours are are so often what underpin those acts of what can be quite extreme physical violence. And I was rereading, because I'm re-releasing See What You Made Me Do, the book, next year, so I was rereading part of that, and a lot of what was really important to include in that was to say, just like we did with Me Too, where we came to grips with the really difficult, visceral nature of sexual violence and sexual harassment, was to say, look up close, this is what a rape looks like. This is what a really severe physical attack looks like. I guess some of the emphasis on those controlling behaviours has been so strong because for a lot of people in Australia, they have no idea that isolation and degradation and monitoring and all that was part of domestic violence. So it's, I think with any kind of awakening to a new reality, it ends up, the pendulum swings all the way in one way. And I think, I agree completely what Ashlee is saying, is that the pendulum has to come back to the middle to say that all of this is happening. Some women are experiencing much more sadistic levels of violence than others, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and subjected to that often by non-Aboriginal men who find it easier to target them because of all the systemic violence that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experience, and the disadvantage there. So I just wanted to add that I think that the reckoning on coercive control should not be that we are now just focusing on non-physical and you know, all those sorts of types of violences.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that we can't make the conversation more comfortable by making the violence sound less dangerous. And to me, that's what coercive control has done for Aboriginal women. And you proved that in the show that you did. Look what they made me do. An Aboriginal woman was standing there, covered in blood, with a towel, with a sheet wrapped around her, pleading to the police along with her father, he's going to kill my baby, he's going to kill my baby. What did they do? They threw her in the back of a bull wagon, and what happened? That little boy died. And yet, so she was victimised through all of that. And even though you put that all on national TV, Jess, that didn't get that much traction for Aboriginal women. And that's why I respect you, because you put that front and centre for everyone to see, and still Australia didn't respond, I don't think, in the way that you anticipated. And that's to really highlight the eight ball, for want of a better term at the moment, for Aboriginal women in domestic, family and sexual violence. Because do our lives really matter? You only have to look at those plans, like in 2023, is it? Oh, we're in 25. 33, whatever, when the national plan, to eliminate violence against women, all women. But the one for Aboriginal women is a year before, but that's only 50%. Now, I heard at a conference that I was with at recently that they had to put that number there because they didn't even want to put a number. So do Aboriginal women's lives really matter? We talk about the missing and murdered, that it's misidentification. Misidentification, is really saying, that it was a mistake. It's not a mistake, it's racism.
Oh, yeah.
And until we, note that and hear that and not cover it with all these new fancy terms, it's confusing for Aboriginal women. You go out Western Arcs, Aboriginal community, what's coercive control? They don't know that language. If you say, what is your man standing over you? Yeah. So it's the dialogue too. It's the way that we word things, and that's problematic because everything, I say this every time, everything is seen through a middle class white lens, and that white lens does not see Aboriginal women.
100%. And I think this is the challenge and the conversations that we keep having to have, and the questions that we keep needing to ask. What frame are we looking through? When we're looking to solve things, what are the alternatives? What are the examples right in front of us, and our long and rich history that we can lean into to help solve these kinds of violence. And I wanted to come to you on an element of what you were talking about earlier, particularly with money, because money matters, and we're also talking about that so much more in respect of abuse these days. Your reports, The Choice and The Cost, show us that economic dependency is both a result of violence and can also be, very clearly, the reason why women stay, because they can't afford to leave. So how is patriarchal violence also economic violence?
Well, it's a really important question.
Microphone.
Sorry. It's a really important question, Annabelle, and one that's quite complicated. The way I've tried to address it in the two reports that you referred to has been to use data that hasn't been accessible before, which has been able to actually prove certain things about women's income or lack of, women's lack of employment directly associated with domestic violence, women's not finishing university degrees directly related to these young girls' experience of domestic violence and the lifelong consequences there are stemming from that. But I think the thing that really, the many shocking statistics that I came across, there's a couple that are kind of more shocking than anything else, and perhaps not as shocking as the kinds of physical violence that Ashlee's talking about, and certainly not as shocking as women being murdered. But what these figures show is the extent to which men are prepared to go to stop women being able to have the financial wherewithal to have independence and freedom. And these figures are from the Personal Safety Survey of 2021-22, so it's a couple of years ago. It shows that 451,000 women, that's nearly 500,000 women, had previous partners who had controlled or tried to control them from working or earning money, while a further 538,400 women had a previous partner who controlled or tried to control their income or assets. Now, I mean, the scale of that is quite extraordinary. We also have figures showing women who are with current partners. 30,700 report their current partner has controlled or tried to control them from earning money, and 33,200 women reported that their current partner was controlling or trying to control their income or assets. Now, one of the things that we know also from this data work is that 60% of women who experience domestic violence are in the workplace. Now, you might assume that, okay, they're working, they can leave. But the reason they probably can't leave is probably the kind of job they have. They don't earn enough to leave. There may be other reasons to do with their children, to do with their attachment to their partner. They still love him for whatever reason. There are cultural reasons that prevent a lot of women from leaving because of the sanctions that are applied to them within their societies. So we can't be too judgmental about this, but all we can do is look at the bare numbers and say, look, of all the women who are experiencing domestic violence at the moment, 60% are in the workforce. That means they're sitting next to us every day of the week where we work, whether we know it or not, whether they disclose it or not. And so the whole issue about women earning money or women not earning money or men trying to force them not to earn money. The other figure that I got in the choice was of the 200 and... where was it? 275,000 women left their husbands in 2016. 12,000 returned because they had no money. So at the end of the day, it is all about the money. If you don't have enough money to get away, to be able to build a decent life for yourself and your children, you are trapped. And that, to me, that is patriarchal violence at its core. That's what it's all about.
And I think the data that's come out from the reports and the work that you've done has been extraordinary, and it's had, I think, a really landmark impact. I mean, working in women's refuges and shelters, what we see is that close to 100% of the women that we support have been financially abused in some form. And that is no surprise. But it hasn't really been talked about very much, except recently.
Or measured.
Or measured, exactly right, exactly right. Yeah. And so I'm going to take us towards envisioning a future, envisioning a hopeful future a little bit. And I'm going to come to each of you on this, but I want to start with you, Jess. What do you think it would take to build services that both prevent and respond, that are not just non-violent in the way that we construct them, but also perhaps anti-patriarchal, if we could ask for that as well?
I think if you were thinking of a principle that you would basically draw from in terms of building those services, is that you have dignity-centred practice for the people that you're serving. And I feel like if everything comes back to that basic value, you are creating something that is egalitarian and actually serves and protects the people that you're aiming to do that for. I think sometimes you see across, across the refuge movement, and I've heard horror stories from some refuges in the regions, particularly of service rules that totally infantilise women. that, you know, basically require them to pay for their stay within 2 weeks of them moving in so that they can prove they can be financially independent. It's like women who have, you know, fled the threat of homicide with like 3 children, like 1 infant under their arm. And I think recognising resistance amongst women and kids, and not punishing those coping strategies or the efforts that victim survivors make at getting their perpetrators to desist, the fact that they may return because they still believe he can be changed, not just because they are afraid of being destitute, but because they are invested in that relationship and they feel like there is no one else that can absolve them of the pain that they've been subjected to than the person who subjected them to that pain. I think recognising and respecting all of that and holding that dignity at the centre of that practice, that is, for me, the key. Not punishing women for using substances to cope, not punishing or not coercing women, not reinstating a version of what these women and kids have just escaped in order to, quote unquote, keep them safe.
Really powerful. I think it's such a nice way to think about it, and it also, I think, builds into some of the conversations that we've had almost that emerged out of Me Too, and about believing and taking women seriously. You know, we have so much of a narrative that runs through public discourse about minimising what women say when they speak to a truth. Oh, she's crazy. Just don't listen to her. She's crazy. You know, don't believe what she says. Like, she's got to be lying about it. You know, and I think that the counterpoint to that in the services that we build is exactly as you've said. It's building that dignity, building that respect, meeting women where they are, and taking them seriously when they tell us the truth.
Totally, and I think it's also asking that question: what made her sound crazy? You know, it's like the other thing that sometimes I talk about in education is when you have police or other, you know, service providers even saying, well, you know, it takes 2 to tango. And it's like, what did you just say? It takes 2 to tango. What happens in a tango? One person leads and the other follows. So maybe you could find out who's leading this dance. You know, like, it's like there's so many clues, even in the offhand comments people make, that if they were just to interrogate their own language, they might actually be able to fix things.
And Ashlee, you've spoken a lot about changing the belief system and also the damaging approach of helicopter money. I loved your characterisation of that when we were meeting to prepare the panel. So what do you think, in your view, that real financial self-determination and real practical support for Aboriginal women would look like?
I just want to touch on one little thing before I go there. And I meant to say this in the first instance, and that's, we can't dismantle patriarchy while sidelining the very women who've been resisting it the longest in this country, and that's Aboriginal women. I just want that noted in the notes. Who's ever taken notes? I can't remember what I said to you in the thing meeting, but I must have been good because
it was excellent. What you were talking about
perimenopause, remember?
Was sort of hey, we've all been there, girl. Helicoptering money in and dropping it down.
Yep. I've got that here, yes. Now I know where I'm at. So when I talk about changing belief systems, I mean shifting away from the idea that Aboriginal women can be fixed with short-term top-down programs. That's what I mean. What I call the helicopter approach. We're going to what is it? Frame that now.
Yep.
So Ashlee said that. So that's when money drops in with strings attached, right? For a year or two and then disappears. It keeps us dependent on someone else's priorities instead of building our own. That's what it means. Now, I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but Mudge and Gold, the organisation that I run, is the only 100% run by and for Aboriginal Women's Centre in metropolitan Sydney. Probably New South Wales, if I'm absolutely honest. Even our accountant is Aboriginal. That's how far we go. Last year was the first time we've ever received money for domestic, family or sexual violence in that organisation from the government. 33 years. So we've been doing the domestic violence, family violence, sexual violence for all those years on donations and philanthropic. And one of the reasons why I come up with that term is that I was speaking to one of, I'm not going to name people or anything, but speaking to one of the people in a high place, and we were talking, and I was so frustrated because all the submissions I was putting in, and I've been at Mudgee 5 years in this role, were just getting rejected, and I said, I'm so sick of bleeding our trauma on the pages of these submissions for the white gaze to then reject how traumatic our lives are in this space. And she turned around and she said to me, she said, oh, well, we have to ask those questions so that we can make sure that you understand. I said, so you're asking me to make you understand how bad domestic, family and sexual violence is in this country for Aboriginal women? And she, oh my goodness, like realised that the brain thought of that even having to be a thing. And that's what we're up against. So that's what I mean. It's all good to get funding for a worker, but if there's no money to help the clients, what's it called? Brokerage, you know? Yeah. If we don't have that to help our clients, and there's no point just having a worker, you know, if we can't put a screen door. I had a lady come in yesterday, and she's housed and everything. She doesn't want to go back to the house. She's luckily got into a refuge, which is hard to do anyway when you've already got a house. And, you know, the people that were working with, oh, we can get cameras. And she turned around and she said, cameras aren't going to keep me safe. So we have to think, you know, we have to centre the women, like we all say. Like, well, what do you want us to do? What's going to make you safe? And that's what's missing in this space too, is talking about safety and what that looks like for all different, because all different nationalities have different ways of feeling safe and being and doing. And again, it's all in that middle-class white lens, and so it's all missed. So if we're going to talk truth, then we've got to make it truthful and honest and safe for all women. So that's the helicopter approach. Don't just drop money in because it looks good for your ticking your boxes, because it's not really helping. I mean, you know what I mean.
And I think you're right, that short-term funding approach is also a way to keep services dependent, to keep them compliant, and, you know, really to kneecap you for being able to embed good work and keep it going.
I was actually scared that I was being set up to fail. That's how suspicious I was of receiving funding, because I was thinking they're going to chuck this big money at me, and then, you know, what am I going to do, like type thing. And so I had to like really think, and I was reluctant to sign, but it's not about me. You see, it's about the women that walk through the door, and, you know, Mudgee serves some of the most disadvantaged women in Sydney, all over. They come from all over, and it's, you know, it's daily. It's not like just a one-off thing. It's a daily occurrence. So it's not like other services where clients aren't walking in. Like our Aboriginal women will come to our service rather than go to the police, and so then we have to navigate the level of safety for them. Do we call the police? And then no, don't go down there, because they'll ring the police on you. So we have to, but then if she's there and you could see that she needs stitches or something, you say it's the balance is scary for us, because if something happens to that woman while she's in our service, then it's our responsibility. So what we do is call the ambulance, and then the ambulance, as those people do all the stuff, and then we keep our name well. Don't quote me on that, because we don't want to. But this is what we have to do. You know, it's not like other services. If I'll tell you another quick little story. Here I go. I told you to keep me on notes. We rocked up at work. Our workers rocked up at work one morning. There was an Aboriginal woman sitting at the front door, naked, flicking a lighter. Any other organisation, what would they have done? Called the police. What did we do? Took her inside. And then when the police came, and they said, oh, God, you've handled that well, because we knew she was one of our rough sleepers. We knew she was off her medication. We knew that she wasn't well. She'd come there, want a shower, we would give her a feed, and we've got like this little chair that folds out to a bed, and she'd sleep up there all day because she wasn't sleeping at night, because it wasn't safe for her. And so, you know, we knew what to do. But so that's what we're up against.
And the rapid review last year, to take us right back up to the superstructural level. Let's get in the elevator and zoom up to the top. In your view, what are some of the leverage points that we could take advantage of for real and rapid change? Do you think we've got some quick wins that we could activate right now?
Well, this is something, Jess, of course, was also
Yes.
on the rapid review. There were 6 of us all together. She and I were 2 of them. And we've recently been talking to each other about this because we are pretty pissed off, to put it politely, that it's now a year since we submitted that report. And at the time, we weren't even sent a copy of it, let alone a letter of thank you or anything like that. And we still haven't heard anything at all from the government as to what has happened with those findings. And so we have decided that we are going to write to the Minister, who's Katie Gallagher, and ask for a briefing on the outcome of the report and which of the 26 recommendations, I think it was.
21, yeah.
Something like that.
A lot.
It wasn't a lot, really. I mean, it was,
21 areas.
it was a manageable area. But there are a number of things that were very practical, and in fact, one that we recommended that they agreed to, which was to restrict the sale of alcohol. But whether they said they would, but whether they did, whether it happened, we don't know.
Well, I think so far only South Australia, of all the states and territories, has even drafted a bill.
Okay, so they didn't do it. The 2 things that we concentrated on a lot of things, and one of the areas that I particularly concentrated on was a personal thing of mine is suicide, women's suicide, and how many women commit suicide to escape domestic violence, and then they are not counted amongst the women dead from domestic violence, and they should be. They are in England, they should be. The other issue is the number of deaths, murders that are made to look like suicide. Whole issue there. We asked for an inquiry into this, that hasn't happened. But of the 2 fairly practical things that could be done immediately, which we thought they would agree to, was one is to have a bigger role for GPs, to start putting a lot more of the sort of onus on not disclosure and also on perhaps sort of minor forms of help that can be given in a GP's room. We're not talking about need for ambulances and stuff. And that people trust GPs. People will trust GPs and they will tell them things that they're not going to tell the police, or they're not going to perhaps even tell their family members, or they can't tell their family members if they come from certain cultures where, it's shameful to talk about that. So we were suggesting a bigger role for GPs in all of this, and bringing GPs into the whole ecosystem of the family domestic violence world. And this is something that could be done very easily and relatively cheaply, and I don't think it has been done.
No.
And the second thing that we recommended that, again, and I think should be done is to pay a lot more attention to children. One of the things that's happens in domestic violence is that you've got, and traditionally, the women's refuges have looked after the women and the kids, but the women primarily the focus. Child support looks after the children. The interests do not always coincide. And often children are removed who shouldn't be removed. I mean, probably no children should be removed, but children should not be removed because, and I remember sitting in on a meeting once of a whole lot of child support workers at a training session, and they were talking about, they were trying to get these women to be sympathetic to the mothers. And I couldn't believe the hostility these caseworkers had towards the mothers. They are trained to look after the children, and they don't care about the mothers. They're either actively hostile, they hate them, they think they're bad mothers, it's their fault of the violence, all of that. So we have got to find ways to break down that way of thinking. We've got to bring the women and the kids together, and the people who are involved in the system have got to understand that they both have their issues, and they've both got to be dealt with often separately. And the main point is that if we really want to stop violence, we've got to intervene with those kids so that they don't repeat those patterns of behaviour as they become adults. And we know that. We've always known that. But what are we doing about it? So we recommended immediate action on this. And again, we don't know the result.
Jess, would you like to call out any more of those, of the low-hanging fruit or the opportunities that we could grab right now to make a change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to add to what we were saying about the medical system, we were recommending, and we were told that this was actually possible and that the Federal Health Minister could authorise this mandatory training for GPs and for psychologists as a requirement for certification. And I think that these are things that you need to start putting into practice now, as well as continuing professional development being mandatory on family violence. When you consider the scale of it, 4 in 10 kids are growing up with domestic and family violence. 3 in 10 are growing up being subjected to emotional abuse. You know, like this, the scale of it is so gigantic that if you are working in these areas and you don't understand this, you don't understand the people who are coming to see you. You know, a large percentage of them, or their backgrounds. So I think that was really clear. One thing that also was a very big focus. I mean, the children were the priority. That was like children and young people, make them the priority, because right now we can't even really properly see children as people. And that was feminism's sort of great achievement, to say that women are people too. And now we need to go further and say children are people too. But at the moment, we subject them to systems like child protection, particularly Aboriginal children, like youth justice, again, particularly Aboriginal children, many of them survivors of type of violence or trauma, and we make them more traumatised by subjecting them to greater levels of abuse, leaving them in systems that leave them open to exploitation. This just seems like obvious. You need a complete system reset and reframe on that. The low-hanging fruit is not just the way that perpetrators can weaponise systems, but the way systems are inherently weaponised against people, and that this is in the power of federal and state and territory governments to change. And that's what, I mean, that stopping perpetrators weaponising systems was, I think, one of the more radical recommendations in the report, but it's also one that got the most traction from government, because it was something they could take and say, yes, we can do that. Like, we can look at the way that child support is weaponised. We can look at the way the tax office is weaponised. And they are progressing that. We don't know what else is being progressed.
They won't tell us about it.
They won't tell us. It's like, we're your ambassadors. Like, we can tell people what you're doing, but you just don't have the time or the interest in telling us. So anyway, but I think that there's a number of things there that where they picked up. There was also one other thing I'd mention. There were recommendations around police and backing in the Commission of Inquiry in Queensland for true accountability, civilian-led accountability for police. And until we have civilian-led accountability for police, until we have accountability for courts, we're going to be stuck in this trap that we're stuck in at the moment, which is victim survivors feeling like they have to take their lives and their children's lives in their hands if they go and seek that kind of help.
I'm going to bring us into land because we're coming up to time. I want to come to you, Ashlee, for some final thoughts. In a future free from patriarchal violence, what does real full safety look like, in your view?
For me, I've written this down again so I don't go off on a tangent. Real safety is when our women are not just surviving violence but living with dignity, choice and freedom. It's when our daughters and granddaughters grow up without that constant low-level fear in their bodies. It's safety that is cultural, emotional, physical and economic all at once. And it's when sovereignty over our lives is respected as the foundation of our safety. And I say that because I have 6 grandchildren, 1 on the way, so I'll be 7 in December. 4 of them granddaughters. They range from chocolate chip colour to milky white, right? I don't want a world where my granddaughters walk into any place, whether it be a shop, a job or renting a place or going to get their hair done, where they are treated differently because of the colour of their skin. You know, or because of their nationality when they're asked. Because I sit here looking like a white woman, I know that. I didn't realise that till I moved to Sydney, but, you know, because I was born and raised in Kempsey, I was just a Donohue girl. Anyway, I digress. But the thing is that I just don't... And that's what happens with Aboriginal kids, you know. I don't want to be sitting here having this same yarn, in 20 years, if I'm still around. But you know what I mean? What we're doing isn't working. We've been doing it and it's not working. We have to change it up. And in order to change it up for Aboriginal women, we have to sit at the tables, like at the Rapid Review where there wasn't an Aboriginal woman. And we need women like you, Anne and Jess, to advocate for Aboriginal women to sit in those spaces. You know, because if we're not sitting in those spaces and you're discussing Aboriginal women and children, then you're missing a whole demographic of information. So that's got to change there. That's where we start.
I would just add that we did.
Well, that's good. I'm glad that you need to make that statement that you did, because a lot of people are saying, well, why didn't they say this or didn't say that? So, you know, and that's, again, that transparency, the truth-telling. Say, well, we did do this. And then people can't say, well, why didn't they? Well, like I just did.
Transparency, truth-telling and dignity. What a lovely note to finish on.